Welcome everybody to this month's STEMS webinar. So today our speaker is John Hobbs. So John is a data scientist at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. He's a leading expert on answering quantification for remote sensing retrievals. So he has worked on answering quantification for various NASA missions, including OSUE 2 and 3 for the carbon cycle, AIRS for atmospheric infrared sounder retrievals, and many other missions. So he's really like playing a leading role on bringing statistics for remote sensing retrievals and answering quantification. So he's a member of the JPL Answering Quantification and Statistical Analysis group. There, in addition to retrievals, he also works on various spatiotemporal statistical methods for problems in geosciences, including things like hydrology, carbon cycle science, weather and climate, and so forth. So various things related to Earth remote sensing and Earth observations. And all of this stems from his dual major PhD from ISD University, which he did both in statistics and meteorology. So he has background both in statistics and the domain science application here. And that was a very attractive profile for JPL. So they hired him right after his PhD, and he has been at JPL since then. So today the title of his talk is Simulation-Based Answering Quantification for Infrared Sounder Atmospheric Retrievals. So with that, John, please take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Mikhail. Yeah, it's great to be with you today. As Mikhail said, I'm going to talk about this work on UQ for infrared sounder atmospheric retrievals. The team that's worked on this activity through the course of a couple of different projects is listed here. I think a couple are at least on the call as well. And everybody, all of the co-authors here have been at JPL at least for a brief period. Some of you might recognize Maya Shen, who prior to coming to Carnegie Mellon was an intern with us at JPL for a couple of summers and spent some time working on this project. So the project was originally supported by a NASA technology program called Advanced Information Systems Technology, and since then has been supported by the AIRS satellite mission, which I'll talk about as we move along here. Okay, so just an overview of the talk here. I'll start with a little bit of an overview on NASA Earth Science data products, and sort of the processing pipeline that goes along with that, and then sort of give an overview on our perspective on uncertainty quantification for that pipeline. And then I'll give an introduction and an overview of infrared sounder satellite instruments with specific emphasis on AIRS. And then I'll get into our simulation-based UQ methods and results, and then talk about a few extensions at the end. Okay, so to set the stage here, the figure on this slide gives an overview of NASA's Earth observing fleet of instruments, and sort of as you go to the inside of the spiral here, goes to the earlier missions, and then going out to the outer edges of the spiral goes to some later missions that have recently launched, and then planned missions kind of on the outer edges here. And so it's a pretty extensive fleet, and some of these assets have come and gone. I want to point out a few missions of interest here. Near the inner spiral is Aqua, which was launched in 2002, and it contains the AIRS instrument, which we'll be talking about in this presentation. So Aqua has been in orbit for over 2 decades and has really provided some very valuable data for understanding the Earth system, and we'll talk about AIRS' role in that. And then a few others of note that myself and colleagues have worked on. Orbiting Carbon Observatory 2 is out here, launched in 2014. I think in this forum, my colleague Amy Braverman has talked about our work with that mission, as well as the OCO3, which is Orbiting Carbon Observatory 3, which is actually on the International Space Station. All of these in the middle part of the spiral are ISS assets that NASA has managed or is managing. So it's quite an extensive fleet of instruments, and ideally to advance Earth science using these assets together, along with constellations from other agencies and other international organizations and collaborations, is really the key to advancing Earth science. So the main objective, or NASA's main charge with all of these Earth observing missions, is to produce data products to enable science and applications. And so there's sort of a pipeline of data processing that goes along with that, that has these different levels. And I'm going to talk about level 1 through level 4. And each mission sort of has its own specification and nuance to what these different product levels are. But the descriptions here are broadly applicable and certainly relevant for the infrared sounder missions that we'll be talking about. So level 1, and there's actually an example from AIRS at the bottom of a level 1 data product. And this is actually the instrument data, or the radiance spectra observed by the satellite, and that there's been some minimal processing to that to geolocate to geolocate those observations and apply them in the appropriate sensor units. But these are, for our purposes, the observations that are made by the instrument. The next level is level 2, which are derived geophysical variables. So in the case of AIRS and the infrared sounders, some of these geophysical variables include atmospheric and surface temperature, humidity, concentrations of trace gases in the atmosphere and clouds. So these are geophysical variables, and these are often the quantities of interest for science investigations and applications. And we'll talk about how we sort of move through this progression. But the spatial and temporal resolution of level 2 is the same as that of level 1. And then the higher levels, level 3 and level 4, I'll mention a little bit about how level 3 products can be produced. But these are often the same geophysical quantities as level 2, but they're sort of processed and analyzed to uniform space-time grids to make them a little bit more consistent and complete in space and time, which makes them a little bit more readily usable for science and applications. Level 4, I won't talk about this too much today, but this is additional products that use the lower level products in combination with some sort of geophysical model to conduct inference and produce estimates of other quantities of interest. So a common application to produce level 4 is something like data assimilation. Whoops, let me back up here. Okay, so a little bit on uncertainty quantification perspective on the pipeline here. We'll focus today on level 1 to level 2, and in a lot of cases, in particular AIRS, which we'll talk about today, this progression from level 1 to level 2 is an inverse problem that's typically called a retrieval in remote sensing. And so a lot of our work on these missions has been to take a look at this level 1 to level 2 retrieval from the perspective of uncertainty quantification. And my colleague Amy Braverman and our team has worked on this on multiple missions. And the paper I referenced there is the work from OCO2 that came out in the Journal on Uncertainty Quantification a couple of years ago. We'll talk about the sort of extension and specific details of this implementation for the infrared sounder in this presentation. The level 2 to level 3 in terms of uncertainty quantification and statistical methodology really requires or is definitely bolstered by a characterization of the uncertainty in that first part of the pipeline. And that's particularly important if we want to integrate the level 2 products from multiple platforms or multiple instruments. I'll talk a little bit about this data fusion problem near the end of the talk, but that's a really important piece, is to have a characterization on the level 2 products to move that forward. And then level 4 is also often an inverse problem as well. Data assimilation is kind of the classic example of this, and there's often an inverse problem there as well to infer a quantity of interest at that stage. So that is kind of the perspective. Now we'll sort of drill down to this level 1 to level 2 problem. One way to think about uncertainty in this context is lack of knowledge about a geophysical quantity of interest after observing relevant data. And so in the remote sensing context, the relevant data we'll sort of be thinking about is that level 1 data. And I'll show some more examples of that shortly, but that's the radiant spectra observed by a satellite like AIRS. And a geophysical quantity of interest, we'll be talking a lot today about atmospheric temperature. So after observing the satellite spectra, we want to characterize our knowledge about that quantity of interest. So notationally, we're going to call that quantity of interest X. And probability offers a coherent framework for representing the distribution. And we might want to characterize that in different ways. Our level 2 pipeline is certainly going to produce some sort of estimate of that quantity, and we'll call that X hat. So we may want to characterize the distribution of the error of that estimate. And just another note here about sort of getting our heads around this framework conceptually. A lot of these earth science data records coming from satellites are relying on increasingly complex methods for getting these estimates. And so having this conceptual and probabilistic mathematical framework is really important. Some examples of that are these retrievals that we'll talk about today, and data assimilation, particularly for that level 4 stage that we talked about, often uses Earth system models and a lot of different data sources. Okay, so the workhorse for the talk today is shown here on this slide. This is what we call an observing system uncertainty experiment. And we've sort of developed this framework and implemented it in various different situations for different projects at JPL. And this one is particularly relevant for AIRS, but the framework is applicable to this level 1, level 2 inverse problem more broadly. And so we'll sort of step through the schematic here as we go along. But the overall idea here is we basically want to set up and execute a simulation framework with a particular emphasis on characterizing the unknowns probabilistically. And we want that simulation system to essentially mimic the satellite observing system from the level 1 to the level 2. So that's kind of what's shown here in the schematic. Up in the upper left, we have X, which is this geophysical state. It'll constitute a number of these quantities of interest. And we start with a plausible multivariate probability distribution for the state and actually generate realizations from that distribution. Then in the middle, top middle here, we actually feed that through a physical forward model. That's what the F is here. And then add some systematic error and random error to produce synthetic satellite radiances, which we'll call Y. And then once we have those, then we can feed those into the operational retrieval pipeline over here on the right, and that will produce an estimate of the state X hat. The retrieval, we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics for errors of this retrieval, but it's kind of a combination of a computational, mathematical, and statistical implementation of that inverse problem to attain that retrieval. Sometimes these are Bayesian in nature, but not always. And the nice thing about this framework is it's relatively generic, that it's applicable to a wide variety of these retrieval algorithms. So once we execute that pipeline on the top, we basically have a joint distribution of the state, the radiances, and the retrievals that we can interrogate in a number of ways. So we can get at that error distribution I mentioned earlier. And another thing that we'll focus on in the talk here is a conditional distribution of the true state X given the retrieved state X hat. So that's the overview. I think next we'll get into a little bit about AIRS. AIRS is the atmospheric infrared sounder, and it's on the Aqua. It's an instrument on the Aqua satellite, and as I mentioned earlier, has been providing remote sensing data for weather and climate since 2002. AIRS was kind of the first in what's now a growing constellation of infrared sounders. So there's a number of AIRS-like instruments in orbit on other platforms that are operated by various international and U.S. agencies. So there's sort of a continuity of record aspect to this whole enterprise as well that I'll touch on a little bit later. So AIRS, a little bit about on how AIRS observes. The little map here shows each of these gray swaths is a single orbit orbit track for AIRS, and then so it's a polar orbit, so it kind of basically goes south to north along these tracks, and then as it's going along that polar orbit, it scans as shown here across track, and so it gets pretty substantial coverage across the orbit track as well. And one other item of note in the upper right there is this is showing is the actual individual spatial footprints for AIRS, and you can see that there's this 3x3 array of little circles, which are individual footprints for AIRS, and these are called fields of view. And then they're sort of grouped into these 3x3 arrays as shown up here, and are sort of analyzed as a collection in that sense, because at least for part of the duration of the AIRS mission, there was a corresponding microwave instrument called AMSUE, which is the dotted circle, that had a larger footprint, and the two instruments could be used in concert to carry out the retrieval. These days, AIRS is operating on its own. AMSUE is no longer operating, but this strategy is still sort of employed for the AIRS retrieval. So that's the overview. A little bit on the spectral observation. So AIRS, as its name suggests, observes in mostly in the infrared part of the spectrum. So in the schematic at the bottom, this is sort of a wide range of wavelengths that are potentially observable over the Earth, and the regions that are shaded in purple are the ranges of wavelengths that AIRS observes in, and so those are mostly in the infrared part of the spectrum, with a little bit into the visible part of the spectrum. So as you get into that infrared part of the spectrum, those observations, there's a sensitivity to thermal emission from the atmosphere and the surface. And so essentially what that translates to is the radiant spectra from AIRS are sensitive to temperature in the atmosphere and the surface and changes in temperature. In addition, you can sort of see this figure also shows parts of the spectrum where there's absorption from various different gases in the atmosphere. And so where AIRS is observing, there's substantial absorption from water vapor. And so water vapor humidity is another key quantity of interest for AIRS. And then there's other trace gases where there's absorption in the part of the spectrum that AIRS observes, including ozone, methane, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. So there is potential information in the AIRS observations for all of these quantities. So another geophysical quantity, a geophysical property that AIRS is sensitive to is clouds. And it's quite sensitive to clouds, which is both good and bad in various ways. So AIRS definitely provides valuable information about clouds and their variability across the globe and over time. On the other hand, the presence of clouds can make the estimation of those other quantities like water vapor and temperature and trace gases a bit challenging. So what we're looking at here is one of those 3x3 arrays of AIRS observed radiances. It's shown here in the center array. I've plotted that radiant spectra in terms of brightness, temperature, as a function of the spectral channel here. And so this is for the center field of view of that 3x3 array. And then the remaining cells, I just took the difference for that given cell from the center cell. So you can see that across the array of these fields of view, there are deviations, there's variability in the spectral information that's available from AIRS. And a lot of that variation across the 9 cells here is due to sort of differential cloud cover across those different fields of view. I don't think I mentioned this earlier. Each of the fields of view has a spatial footprint of about 15 kilometers across. So variability in cloud coverage on the order of tens of kilometers can sort of be distinguished from the AIRS data like this. So that's a key characteristic. So that's a little bit of the overview of the information available from AIRS and what some of the quantities of interest are. And so now I'm going to get into our simulation framework and the uncertainty quantification that arises from that. So going back to this observing system uncertainty experiment, we carry these experiments out sort of in a stratified fashion. And we call these strata geophysical templates. So we sort of carry them out under a specific set of atmospheric and observing system or observing conditions. And that usually constitutes a range of times and locations and also observing conditions. For example, the AIRS has both an ascending and descending portion of its polar orbit. So it actually observes locally during the daytime and also at night. So we can set up these just geophysical templates to represent both the day and the nighttime observing conditions. So to set up the simulation experiment, then we need some reference data to characterize the behavior of the atmosphere and the surface, as well as the satellite under those different conditions. So the example we'll talk through the rest of the presentation here. We've done this over the continental United States, and we've partitioned the templates according to the regions shown at the bottom there, which are regions that have been used in the National Climate Assessment. So, a lot of these investigations with this setup are motivated by applications or other use cases downstream. Data fusion is one that's relevant for AIRS and complementary instruments. And there's also been a lot of use of AIRS temperature and humidity data for a number of applications, such as monitoring drought over the continental US. So those are some motivating examples for carrying this out. So a little bit earlier, I talked about the sort of general setup for the simulation experiment. Here's a little bit more detail on the specific implementation for AIRS and how the retrieval enters in the AIRS case. So over here on the upper left is sort of where we start the pipeline, as I talked about earlier, by constructing an ensemble of synthetic atmospheric and surface states. So we call those XSIM. And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about exactly what goes into the XSIM state vector here. We generate those, and then we feed those through a physical forward model that also has some additional parameters that we'll call B here. That forward model in our implementation is a forward model that's it's called a 2-slab model that's been implemented by some members of the AIR science team. And this has a reasonably realistic representation of the response of the radiant spectra to clouds. And so we use that as the forward simulation. And then we, as mentioned earlier, add some measurement error. That's the epsilon here. There's also the opportunity to add some systematic error, which we call model discrepancy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later and the role of this component in the pipeline. So once we've done sort of the top level here, we've got an ensemble of simulated satellite radiances, and we can actually feed those into the operational AIRS retrieval. And there's sort of a couple steps to that processing. There's an initial stage called cloud clearing, which uses the radiances across that 3x3 array to get an initial estimate of the variable cloud cover across that array. And then it produces, this step produces what's called a cloud cleared radiance. That's the YCC here. And then that goes into a second step of the retrieval, which is, and then this second step executes estimation of the other geophysical quantities like temperature and humidity. in the retrieval. And so then we end up with our estimate, and we do this sort of in a Monte Carlo fashion, so we get an ensemble of the true states and retrieved states. Okay, so a little bit more on the state vector, the X, that we're interested in here. That's what's described on this slide. It's in the case of airs and the infrared sounders more broadly, it's really a substantial collection and heterogeneous collection of quantities. So it includes temperature, humidity, clouds, and surface properties. So I've sort of, at least schematically, kind of partitioned it into different components. The X sub T and X sub WV are temperature and water vapor and their vertical profile. And the two panels on the left of the slide here sort of show a typical distribution of temperature as a function of vertical, of height, and then relative humidity. So those both are in the state vector. There's a few surface properties, and then there's other trace gas concentrations, in particular ozone. And then there's a couple of the rest of the panels on the figure on the slide here show various quantities having to do with clouds. And so the model that I mentioned on the previous slide sort of conceptually cast the cloud properties into 0, 1, or 2 cloud layers, and then various properties of those cloud layers, like their vertical position, how much horizontal coverage they have, and how much ice or water they contain, are all part of this part of the state vector. And so the figures sort of summarize those behaviors for one of our templates. So it's a rather heterogeneous collection of components that goes into that. In addition, we're interested in representing the probability distribution. And so to get our reference data for these state vectors, we make use of the information that's out there for us. And really it comes down to, we use a combination of reanalysis products, potentially nature runs from weather or climate models, as well as, if needed, some actual level 2 products from airs, for example. And then to represent that distribution, that joint distribution of the state X, we sort of do a normal score transformation for variables that we need to do that on, for example, relative humidity and cloud fraction. The middle and right figures at the bottom sort of illustrate that for those two parts of the state vector. And then to sort of get a generic representation, we use a mixture model for a template to represent that probability distribution. Once we have that, then we can generate synthetic states randomly from that model and then feed it through the simulation pipeline. So once we do that and carry out the retrieval, the retrieval algorithm, we get to the bottom part of that observing system experiment pipeline, which I've shown up here on this slide. We have that joint distribution of the synthetic true states, radiances, and retrieved states. And our emphasis in the analysis here is looking at the distribution of the true state given the retrieved state, so X given X hat. The reason for doing that is we of course, in our simulation experiments, have all of that information available. But then if we want to apply this to operational products, we have from the operational products the retrievals, the X hat. So the insight we gain in assessing the simulation, we can apply to the operational products, where we can condition on that retrieved state. So we may be interested in this point here. We may be interested in a specific function of the true state. And in fact, in what I'll show in the remainder of the talk, we're interested in a specific scalar function, which is the near surface air temperature. And so that's actually a scalar function that we're interested in. And I'm sort of illustrating that joint distribution in some bivariate slices at the bottom of the slide here. So in these three panels, that near surface temperature true state that we're interested in is on the y-axis, and then we're looking at its joint distribution with other quantities in the retrieved state vector. And so to characterize this joint distribution, we use a Gaussian mixture model. And so that's kind of what's shown schematically in the figure is the resulting fitted Gaussian mixture, these bivariate slices, and the characteristics of the different mixture components that arise from that Gaussian mixture model fit. So the left panel is interesting because what we're showing there is we actually get out of the retrieval, we get a retrieved near surface temperature. And so this is the joint distribution of the true and retrieved near surface temperature. So this procedure can effectively attempt to bias correct that retrieved near surface temperature. And then we also incorporate some additional dependence on other characteristics of the retrieval. Just one other point on the bottom here is that what I've done for these individual points is then if we actually plug in a retrieved state, that's what each of the little black points represents, we can then get a conditional distribution for our true quantity of interest given specific values of that retrieved state. And that's what we'll assess on subsequent slides here. So we carry this out for this near surface air temperature. This slide gives a little bit of an illustration of the behavior of that procedure over the course of several days of AIRS observations. So there should be a little cycle through animation here. So the top panels are the nighttime cases and the bottom are the daytime. And on the left, we're just plotting basically the mean of that distribution we constructed on conditional distribution we constructed on the previous slide, and how that behaves for the various locations of the AIRS retrievals. In the center panels are the difference between that mean and the operational AIRS retrieval. So this is sort of the impact of that effective bias correction, if you will, due to this procedure in the center panels. And then the right is just the standard deviation that arises from that distribution for near surface temperature. So yeah, okay. So that's some of the information that we can get for these individual AIRS retrievals using this simulation-based procedure. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk through a little bit of evaluation that we've been doing for this. So based on the procedure I discussed, we can apply this to an operational AIRS retrieval, and we get a distribution basically for the near surface temperature. So that's this, what I'm going to call UQ here. From the AIRS operational pipeline, we can get a little bit of analogous information. We can get the retrieved near surface temperature, the X hat for each retrieval. And there is an operational error estimate as well. So for this comparison, we can sort of say, okay, well, let's consider a Gaussian distribution that's centered at that estimate and use that error estimate as a standard deviation. Oops, excuse me. And then we've got some additional reference data with surface observations from the Integrated Surface Database. These are surface-based observations that are quite precise. So that can be a metric for evaluation. So a couple of things that we've looked at with this. We've computed a probability integral transform, or basically evaluating the CDF of these respective distributions at the value of the ISD observation. So that'll give us a value between 0 and 1. And we'd ideally like to see this sort of follow a uniform distribution. And then we've also looked at continuous rank probability score. And that is in the units of the quantity of interest, so Kelvin in our case. So I'll show a few examples of this and summarize some of the assessment on this. This map shows the locations of the ISD stations that we've used in this assessment. This is also in a recent paper by our colleague Peter Kalmus that I'll talk about momentarily. The stations provide observations at hourly intervals or even finer, so we can match up to AIR's retrievals in time relatively closely, and then we can match up spatially, to locations where there are AIR's footprints close to a station or multiple stations. There is sort of a question about representativeness because these are point observations, whereas the AIR's footprints, as we talked about earlier, sort of encompass several or tens of kilometers. So there is this question of uncertainty due to representativeness that enters into this assessment. So I'll show a couple examples of the results here. What we're looking at is a single are the results for a single retrieval and a single matchup. The green bar is the ISD temperature for this particular case. The purple or magenta is the distribution from our simulation-based UQ procedure, and then the blue is the AIR's operational result that I mentioned earlier. So in this particular case, and then I just mentioned the resulting metrics up here. In this particular case, the UQ result, the distribution is perhaps gives a little bit more precise estimate. That's not always the case, but in this case it did. I'll show one more example here. The UQ result is actually gives a larger uncertainty estimate. And in addition to that, you can sort of see the impact of the Gaussian mixture entering in here. It yields a multimodal or at least asymmetric distribution in our simulation-based UQ. And there's also a fairly substantial bias correction, in this case, in a favorable direction for the simulation-based UQ procedure. So just a couple of remarks to sort of summarize this. On the bottom is that probability integral transform result sort of summarized for one of the templates, the southeast region at nighttime. The AIR's retrievals in particular tend to be fairly biased for this particular template. The simulation-based UQ mitigates that to a certain degree, but not entirely. And I think in looking at the results that we've obtained, there are certain templates for which the UQ does definitely yield favorable results, particularly at night. The night case is shown here in the bottom. Daytime results are a little bit more mixed in what we've conducted so far. So another remark on that, and a current avenue of investigation for us is this model discrepancy element of the simulation pipeline. It's something that we're taking a closer look at in the previous work on the orbiting carbon observatory missions. We spent a good deal of time on this and made some modifications to the strategy for the model discrepancy that are capable of reproducing some of the regional patterns of bias. And that's seems to be a real key in this whole pipeline. And so we're in the midst of sort of assessing a different specification for that in the case of errors. So that's ongoing work.
John, just to let you know, we have about 7 or 8 minutes left.
Okay, thanks, Mikhail. Yeah, so I'll get towards wrapping up here. Okay, yeah, so actually I just want to discuss how this methodology can be utilized sort of downstream a little bit. The figure on the right is showing the standard deviation, the distribution of the single sounding standard deviations that arise from the simulation-based procedure, day on top and night on the bottom for the different regions. And they're also grouped by an additional retrieval quantity or retrieval diagnostic on quality that's produced by the retrieval algorithm. So this is additional information that can potentially be exploited and has been in some work that I've been involved in. And going forward, I think it will be useful to understand how the UQ procedure can supplement or aligns with this additional quality information. So the work that's looked at this a little bit is shown on this slide. This is some work we've done with some collaborators at the University of Cincinnati, looking at the vertical profile retrieval from errors. And one note about that vertical temperature information is that actually near the surface is probably the most challenging part of the atmosphere to estimate in the retrieval problem. Higher up in the atmosphere, sort of above clouds, and where there's less heterogeneity due to the surface, more precision can be obtained. And this co-Krieging approach that was taken in this particular work exploits the vertical as well as spatial information horizontally to try to get improved predictions of that vertical temperature profile. And another extension that's important to mention is data fusion. I'll highlight here this paper by Peter Kalmus at JPL and co-authors. Essentially, the goal here is to produce a level 3-like product, which is essentially spatially gap-filled and has regular spatial and temporal resolution, and at the same time combine level 2 products from multiple instruments. So the example here is actually combining these near surface temperature estimates from AIRS and another instrument called CRIS, which is on the NOAA SNPP satellite. It's another infrared sounder. So in principle, we should be able to exploit the information from multiple instruments to estimate a common quantity of interest, like in this situation. The challenge is that each instrument and retrieval is unique and has its own characteristics. Even their internal error estimates could be obtained using different methodologies. So the plug here is that this UQ approach should be applicable across different instruments and retrieval approaches to have a more generic specification of the uncertainty that can be used more readily downstream. Okay, so just some concluding points here on the UQ pipeline, some lessons learned. The geophysical templates and the experimental design should really be targeted to a specific hypothesis, application, or product. And it's also, in setting up the templates, it's important to identify the inputs that are unknown and really go into that state vector from those that are variable and just need to be accounted for, like the observing pattern of the satellite and those sorts of things. We're still wrestling with this model discrepancy specification, and it's really a key component of the pipeline. And we've found that to be the case in other applications as well. And then just a couple of notes. I think I mentioned this on the previous slide, that applying this to other sounder observing systems and retrievals is something we'd like to do down the road, because that will really enable things like data fusion, and will also enable the continuity of the data product record across different instruments. AIRS is sort of in the twilight of its mission, and will be going offline eventually, and these other instruments sort of will be able to fill the gap, but we need to understand the implications of that continuity. And then it would be also useful to extend this framework to a spatial context where we can characterize the spatial dependence and correlation of the retrievals across multiple footprints. So I will wrap there. Thank you very much. Glad to take questions, and I'll just sort of cycle through a couple of reference slides so people can see them down the road. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, John. So once you're done with the reference, I'll stop the recording here, and we'll take some questions.